without taking cheap political shots, can we talk about COVID-19? How will history remember the COVID-19 pandemic? What were the successes? What were the failures of leadership, of man, of humans?
Doom was a book that I was planning to write before the pandemic struck, as a history of the future based in large measure on science fiction. It had occurred to me in 2019 that I had spent too long not reading science fiction, and so I decided I would liven up my intake by getting off history for a bit and reading science fiction. Because history is great at telling you about the perennial problems of power. Putin is always interesting on history. He's become something of a historian recently with his essays and lectures. But what history is bad at telling you is, well, what will the effects of discontinuity of technology be? And so I thought I need some science fiction to think more about this, because I'm tending to miss the importance of technological discontinuity. If you read a lot of science fiction, you read a lot of plague books, because science fiction writers are really quite fond of the plague scenario. So the world ends in many ways in science fiction, but one of the most popular is the lethal pandemic. So when the first email came to me, I think it was on January the 3rd, from my medical friend Justin Stebbing, funny pneumonia in Wuhan, my antennae began to tingle, because it was just like one of those science fiction books that begins in just that way. In a pandemic, as Larry Brilliant, the epidemiologist, said many years ago, the key is early detection and early action. That's how you deal with a novel pathogen. And almost no Western country did that. We know it was doable because the Taiwanese and the South Koreans did it, and they did it very well. But really no Western country got this right. Some were unlucky because super spreader events happened earlier than in other countries. Italy was hit very hard very early. For other countries, the real disaster came quite late. Russia, which has only relatively recently had a really bad experience. The lesson for me is quite different from the one that most journalists thought they were learning last year. Most journalists last year thought, Trump is a terrible president. He's saying a lot of crazy things. It's his fault that we have high excess mortality in the United States. The same argument was being made by journalists in Britain, Boris Johnson, ... Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, ... even India, Narendra Modi. The same argument. And I think this argument is wrong in a few ways. It's true that the populist leaders said many crazy things and, broadly speaking, gave poor guidance to their populations. But I don't think it's true to say that with different leaders, these countries would have done significantly better. If Joe Biden had magically been president a year earlier, I don't think the US would have done much better, because the things that caused excess mortality last year weren't presidential decisions. They were utter failure of CDC to provide testing. That definitely wasn't Trump's fault. Scott Gottlieb's book makes that very clear. It's just been published recently. We utterly failed to use technology for contact tracing, which the Koreans did very well. We didn't really quarantine anybody seriously. There was no enforcement of quarantine. And we exposed the elderly to the virus as quickly as possible in elderly care homes. And these things had very little to do with presidential incompetence. So I think leadership is of somewhat marginal importance in a crisis like this, because what you really need is your public health bureaucracy to get it right. And very few Western public health bureaucracies got it right. Could the president have given better leadership? Yes. His correct strategy, however, was to learn from Barack Obama's playbook with the opioid epidemic. The opioid epidemic killed as many people on Obama's watch as COVID did on Trump's watch. And it was worse in a sense because it only happened in the US, and each year it killed more people than the year before, over 8 years. Nobody, to my knowledge, has ever seriously blamed Obama for the opioid epidemic. Trump's mistake was to put himself front and center of the response, to claim that he had some unique insight into the pandemic, and to say, with every passing week, more and more foolish things, until even a significant portion of people who'd voted for him in 2016 realized that he'd blown it, which was why he lost the election. The correct strategy was actually to make Mike Pence the pandemic czar and get the hell out of the way. That's what my advice to Trump would have been. In fact, it was in February of last year. So the mistake was to try to lead. But actually, leadership in a pandemic is almost a contradiction in terms. What you really need is your public health bureaucracy not to fuck it up. And they really, really fucked it up. And that was then all blamed on Trump.
Yes.
You know, Jim Fallows writes a piece in The Atlantic that says, well, being the president's like flying a light aircraft, it's pilot error. And I read that piece and I thought, does he really, after all the years he spent writing, think that being president is like flying a light aircraft? I mean, it's really nothing like flying a light aircraft. Being president is you sit on top of a vast bureaucracy with how many different agencies? 60, 70, we've all lost count. And you're surrounded by advisors, at least a quarter of whom are saying, this is a disaster, we have to close the borders. And the others are saying, no, we have to keep the economy going. That's what you're running on in November. So being the president in a pandemic is a very unenviable position because you actually can't really determine whether your public health bureaucracy will get it right or not.
You don't think, to push back on that, just like being Churchill in a war is difficult. So leaving Trump and Biden aside, what I would love to see from a president is somebody who makes great speeches and arouses the public to push the bureaucracy, the public health bureaucracy, to get their shit together, to fire certain kinds of people. I'm sorry, but I'm a big fan of powerful speeches, especially in the modern age with the internet. It can really move people. Instead, the lack of speeches resulted in certain kinds of forces amplifying division over whether to wear masks or not, or all. It's almost like the public picked some random topic over which to divide themselves, and there was like a complete indecision, which is really what it was: fear of uncertainty materializing itself in some kind of division, and then you almost like busied yourself with the red versus blue politics, as opposed to some, I don't know, FDR type character just stands and say, fuck all this bullshit that we're hearing. We're going to manufacture 5 billion tests. This is what America is great at. We're going to build the greatest testing infrastructure ever built, or something, or even with the vaccine development.
But that was what I was about to interject.
Yes.
In a pandemic, the most important thing is the vaccine. If you get that right, then you should be forgiven for much else. And that was the one thing the Trump administration got right, because they went around the bureaucracy with Operation Warp Speed and achieved a really major success. So I think the paradox of the 2020 story in the United States is that the one thing that mattered most, the Trump administration got right. And it got so much else wrong that was sort of marginal that we were left with the impression that Trump had been to blame for the whole disaster, which wasn't really quite right. Sure, it would have been great if we did Operation Warp Speed for testing, but ultimately vaccines are more important than tests. And this brings me to the question that you raised there of polarization and why that happened. Now, in a book called The Square in the Tower, I argued that it would be very costly for the United States to allow the public sphere to continue to be dominated by a handful of big tech companies, that this ultimately would have more adverse effects than simply contested elections. And I think we saw over the past 18 months just how bad this could be, because the odd thing about this country is that we came up with vaccines with 90+% efficacy, and about 20% of people refuse to get them and still do refuse for reasons that seem best explained in terms of the anti-vax network, which has been embedded on the internet for a long time, predating the pandemic. René DeResta wrote about this pre-2020. And this anti-vax network has turned out to kill maybe 200,000 Americans who could have been vaccinated but were persuaded through magical thinking that the vaccine was riskier than the virus. Whereas you don't need to be an epidemiologist, you don't need to be a medical scientist to know that the virus is about 2 orders of magnitude riskier than the vaccine. So again, leadership could definitely have been better. But the politicization of everything was not Trump's doing alone. It happened because our public sphere has been dominated by a handful of platforms whose business model inherently promotes polarization, inherently promotes fake news and extreme views, because those are the things that get the eyeballs and the screens and sell the ads. I mean, this is now a commonplace, but when one thinks about the cost of allowing this kind of thing to happen, it's now a very high human cost. And we were foolish to leave uncorrected these structural problems in the public sphere that were already very clearly visible in 2016.